So we'll start again. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty, alums, and those joining us from all over the country. We are delighted to have you here tonight with us in our Seton Hall virtual community. My name is BJ Schecter. I'm a professional resident here at Seton Hall. I've been in the sports media business for more than 30 years, and I'm still very much a part of this evolving industry today. Speaking of evolving, the subject of tonight's event is very much a part of an evolving story. News moves extremely quickly, and we're here to have some very important conversations on issues that transcend sports. Tonight's event is entitled The Gruden Effect, examining the larger issues. We will tackle the story of the John Gruden email saga from all angles, and the various ramifications it has throughout sports and society. Tonight's event is part of the Sports Media Speaker Series here at Seton Hall and is co-sponsored by the College of Communication and the Arts and the Stillman School of Business. We work very closely with our friends at Stillman here at the College of Communication and the Arts, and more specifically, the Center for Sport Management and Professor Charlie Grantham, who is also part of our panel here tonight. Tonight's event, as a reminder, is being recorded. We will have the full version of the event on YouTube later this evening, and we will leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So please feel free to put them in the chat, or we'll have a Q&A at the end with our panelists, where we'll try to get to as many as we can before kickoff to Monday Night Football, of course. Tonight, I'm lucky to be joined by my co-host, who needs no introduction. Bob Ley is an alum here at Seton Hall, a legend at ESPN, many halls, broadcasting halls of fame, but most importantly, he's here with us tonight to do what he did for so many years outside the lines, and tonight's event will be outside the lines style. Bob is working very closely with me and the university here to mentor our future students in media and in the sports industry, and we'll have many more exciting things in the future to talk about here in sports media at Seton Hall. So without further ado, please welcome our co-host tonight, Bob Ley.
You're on mute, Bob.
Bob, you're on mute.
We call that a rookie mistake. Somebody muted me. All right. It has been 10 days since John Gruden's first offensive email came to light, followed a week ago tonight by the torrent of subsequent revelations that the Super Bowl winning coach over a number of years, and while he was the face of ESPN's Monday Night Football, had engaged in an indefensible array of private, offensive comments, racist, homophobic, misogynistic remarks. The comments were directed at Union Chief DeMaurice Smith, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, women officials, you name it. Gruden resigned last Monday within hours of the disclosure of the major tranche of emails, but the story certainly has continued to grow. And you know you're having a bad week as an American institution when the cold open of Saturday Night Live takes you over the coals. And so a fictional Roger Goodell 2 nights ago was seen saying, "When you see me on TV, it's not good." This time, one of our coaches is accused of racism, misogyny, and homophobia. But hey, at least no one's talking about concussions. I assure you, all 32 teams in our league understand that diversity is our strength, and I know our black coaches would agree, both of them. End quote, fictional SNL quote, if you've just joined us, please. Tonight, we consider the larger implications of this developing story, which is why we are thrilled to have George Atala with us tonight. He is the Assistant Executive Director of the NFL Players Association. He works closely with D. Smith, who was the subject of that first Gruden email to be disclosed. Charles Grantham is with us, and we're thrilled for that. He's the former Executive Director of the NBA Players Association. We know him in South Orange as the Director of the Center for Sport Management at the Stillman School for Business. Charlie, good to have you with us. Judy Battista has covered the NFL nationally for nearly 20 years, much of that time with the New York Times, and for the past 8 years with NFL.com and the NFL Network. And Bomani Jones joins us this evening. His observations, his opinions, well known on a number of ESPN platforms. And beginning next year, he'll host his own HBO program. game theory. Congrats on that gig, Bomani. That's tremendous. Thank you all for being here. A lot of places we can go tonight. Let me begin closest to this, which would be you, George, because of that first email and everything that grows out of the membership of your union. What's the most interesting or disturbing thing that you've learned over the past week as the story has continued to grow?
There is a fascinating trigger point for all this that, you mentioned I've worked closely with Dee for nearly 13 years. When DeMorris first came into this job, he was dubbed an outsider. He was dubbed somebody that didn't know football. There were a lot of questions about his leadership heading into what eventually was a lockout by the NFL of its players. And that triggered multiple layers of hurt and pain as his friend, but also the memory of having to fight to have a seat at the table, as you put it, and be considered an equal, frankly. And the two layers to that, in my opinion, one is his identity as a black man, and what it's like to walk into a room of primarily white billionaires. That is a dynamic that I can speak for him. He's always sort of had under the surface as being something that we've had to overcome, or he's had to overcome. And then the second one is being a football outsider. And I think the other revelation to me from all this, and what's most interesting, is that football has a tendency to protect football. And that is a bigger worry that I have, is what else is underneath the surface? What else do we not know about the behavior? The emails are the emails, salacious, indefensible, but how this multi-billion-dollar business is run is really the bigger concern that we have.
Yeah, which is so large, as was the infamous line in the movie Concussion, the league owns a day of the week. Charlie Grantham, what have you seen that has stood out over the last 10 days as the story has just exploded?
Well, for me, I take a slightly different perspective. It's really nothing new. I mean, I go back to Marge Schott. I go back to Donald Sterling. And we can go back to Jackie Robinson when he left baseball, saying that it was time that baseball diversify itself, include more minorities and women in management. This is 2021. Nothing new is really happening here. What I see on the horizon, however, is that time and time again, they prove that the organizational institution of football, of basketball, of baseball, or hockey, it's time for some adjustments and some changes. You got to remember, these are cartels. This is not regular, normal business. These are cartels. They run it the way they choose to run it. At a time when we're looking for diversity, it means the structural change has to start. We got to start from there. And I don't see that happening unless they are compelled to do it by the government or some other outside force, such as the union. The players finally figure and decide that it's going to be a priority. And maybe as a permissive subject of bargaining, they begin to see that 85 or 75 to 80% of our players are Black. Therefore, is this environment that's being created by Gruden and others, is it a hostile environment? Is it? It's a labor management issue of all sports that at some point have to come to a head.
If I could just ask all who joined us as part of our audience, please mute your microphones. Thank you very kindly. Judy, what's your headline from this week?
I was struck by reading the emails, how casual the use of the language was, like how very comfortable they were talking like this. And, I think people, the first story, everybody focused on, well, that was 10 years ago, as if 10 years ago was 1950. Wasn't that long ago. But the more current emails were only a few years ago. And I thought, like, how comfortable do you have to be with expressing these thoughts with this kind of language, to put it in writing to somebody's work email account. That really stood out to me, that they were just so at ease sharing these thoughts, like the kind of thoughts that then, we read and we think they're abhorrent. They clearly didn't think they're abhorrent. It was such a departure from the NFL has talked a lot in the last few years. And I do believe there are people making good faith efforts, for diversity and inclusion on the league side and the union side. I think the players have really lent their voices to this. But it's clear that there are people in very powerful positions, people who are in positions to hire and fire people who not only are not on board, but are so comfortable with not being on board with those thoughts that they feel free to put it in writing.
Yeah, you even have what Amy Trask, the former executive with the Raiders, said yesterday on the CBS Sports Network, that she had heard Bruce Allen make similar comments and had reported him, imputing that she reported this to Mark Davis, to the owner. So there's that. All right, Bomani, it's football, but it's more than football, is it not? I think you're muted, sir.
All right, there we go. Something we can't forget, though, is that the email about D. Smith was not enough to make anything happen. Like, once that came out on Friday, Gruden coaches on Sunday, and the Sunday shows, by and large, had people finding ways to defend that and the idea of that's not the man that I knew. I won't do this off of one thing. But on the larger sample, while the next report was certainly damning and terrible, if you had this big sample of observations with John Gruden, so like, oh, now 6 is enough, right? Like how does this go? The first one would think would be enough for him to have been fired, but it wasn't. That could be talked over. He had to insult some powerful white men. And then all of a sudden we wound up discovering that there was, in fact, a problem that he could be dismissed for. And I admit that when the first email came out and people were like, should he be fired? I'm not so excited about just calling for everybody's job. I was like, I didn't even want to get into that. But the mere idea that this would be presented and the status quo was such that even I would hear that and be like, that's not even a fight worth taking up, says a lot about what people actually find to be grievous and terrible. And that first email apparently wasn't enough.
Still muted, Bob.
I don't know how this happens, but I got muted again. My apologies. Charlie, put yourself in Roger Goodell's position right now. All right, it's a labor management issue. You're also got 32 bosses. You've got 650,000 emails. The league has denied leaking this, and we can take up the question of who would leak this and why. It's been put out as a mafia hit job in almost so many words on John Gruden. But all right, Goodell's position here. Where does he go with this? I mean, denials. That the league was behind the league, fine, but they don't. This brings in the Washington football team investigation. What does the commissioner do?
Remember, he's the mouthpiece of the people who own teams. Basically, they probably have already somewhat decided which strategy he will begin to take, and I guarantee you it will be a continued let's say delay. I mean, you don't forget you've got a legal action in St. Louis. They're asking for $1 billion based on the way the NFL left that city. So these emails can create a major problem, not just a PR problem, but can create a major problem for them in several other areas that they are under scrutiny for at this particular time. So what I see him doing is continue to string it out if he can, with the help of the broadcast crew, if he could. That I think they'll delay some more time here. Ultimately, again, it goes back to we are where we are and where we have been for a long time with regard to diversity. We are where we are. The question is, as an institution, will those who own teams decide that Donald Sterling action, if I can take you back just for a moment, Adam Silver's first response was to vote him out of the league. And then it was Mark Cuban who stood up and basically said, look, we can't do that based on an illegal wiretap. looking out for all those other owners who are thinking about or thinking the same kinds of things. So what turned into, instead of voting and creating a procedure that deals with this behavior, are we talking about behavior? Are we talking about attitudes? We're talking about behavior here, and is there a consequence for this behavior? When we had a 1, 2, 3 strike, you're out for players for drugs, that was a procedure. Bad behavior, procedure. When will the, quote, institution of the NFL, the NBA, et cetera, sit down and say, hey, look, there's some consequences for some of our behavior. What are those consequences? We have not seen that happen in certainly the 3 or 4 decades, but we haven't seen it happen since, what? I can't think of a time that the organization, the Constitution, needs to be amended. The NFL Constitution, Major League Baseball Constitution, just like a collective bargaining agreement is amended. There are procedures. The governance of these leagues has stepped back and have little or no advancement overall this time.
It remains an open question whether the Clippers owner would have been divested absent a recording, whether it was legal or not. BJ?
Well, he bought that team for $10 million and sold it for $2 billion.
Yeah,
and that was his punishment.
Exactly. Yeah, BJ?
Yeah, one thing that struck me in this whole story, as it broke, the spotlight's been on John Gruden, and rightfully so. What he said, he offended just about every group imaginable. But 650,000 emails were supposedly analyzed by the league. And so I immediately wondered, what else is in those emails? What about Daniel Snyder? This whole investigation was all about Washington and the Washington football team and the culture there. I'd love to start with you, George, and then maybe have you weigh in, as well, Judy, from the media side. And are you guys wondering the same thing? And it's been, on what Gruden said first, towards D. Smith, and what he said was horrible, and then he offended a whole bunch of others. But I also wonder what else is there. I mean, are you wondering the same? Is the NFLPA, putting any pressure on the league to, to release what else is there?
Yeah, well, D has called on the league to release the emails in the interest of transparency, in the interest of an independent review, so that we can see what else is there. Was there anything actionable? Again, you go back to some of the points that were hit on earlier. Is this just salacious gossip, which in and of itself is inexcusable and terrible? Or is there a pattern of behavior done by, as Judy put it, very powerful people in the NFL, coaches, administrators, potentially NFL owners, who took action in a way that was, to use a very simple word, unacceptable? That is something that we have an interest in taking a look at. That's the concern. And again, it's been a really rough week because you want to rely on your professional training, your job. You want to have that touchstone of your job. And then on one hand, and then on the other hand, you just sort of have to take account of the human impact that this has had on D, on the people impacted, on people who were offended by it, on Carl Nassib of the Raiders, and the human impact of this is not lost on me. And sure, some people can shrug it off. I mean, I've certainly experienced my own as a Lebanese immigrant, stuff said about me in private and in public. And part of you is just like, okay, we're just going to brush this off and keep moving. But when it's institutional, that's when the full weight of it becomes evident, and you're just reminded of how much more work there is to be done. That can be overwhelming.
I'll talk about it from the media standpoint. I mean, obviously, every reporter wants to see all 650,000 emails, and we have since the Washington football team investigation wrapped up over the summer, right? I mean, that's what this all stems from, which, as you pointed out, I mean, it is maddening that John Gruden deserves everything he is getting, and so does Bruce Allen, for that matter, who has also been part of this. It is maddening, though, that we don't know at the center of it what happened in Washington and what that workplace environment was like beyond, the sort of generalities that we were told when the investigation was wrapped up, that it was a very toxic workplace, and I think highly unprofessional is how they described it. So yes, would I like to see all the emails? Yes, of course. I've got to be honest, I'm a realist. I don't have a whole lot of confidence we're going to see those emails. The reality of the situation is that when they wrapped up that investigation, they announced the $10 million fine and the sort of suspension of Daniel Snyder, that they're not calling a suspension, but he's sort of banished from the team, kind of. And I think we'd all be naive if we didn't think that was not a negotiated settlement, that they arrived at that this would be the penalty and we would not release these things. And as a reporter, I have to assume that there is some ironclad agreement somewhere that means that we're never going to see those emails. And that was part of the deal. So, I'm not getting my hopes up about seeing the emails, but I mean, obviously I wonder what else is in there, since it's hard to imagine that out of 650,000, the only bad ones are the ones that we've already seen.
Bomani, let me ask you about your take on the gap, and it's a real gap, between how stakeholders, the 32 entities who own the National Football League, treat each other and the persuasion they have with the commissioner versus the employees, vis-a-vis that, the lack of a written report with this Snyder investigation, the $10 million fine, which I did a little math. Forbes values the Washington football team at $4.2 billion. So a $10 million fine would be the equivalent of a $600 tax levy on a $250,000 house. All right, so move on. I mean, it's barely a mosquito bite. What do you make of that? Some would say double standard, others would say industrial reality.
Well, power dynamics are interesting when we talk about all this going back to Donald Sterling, because we can't forget a big part of why Silver was able to get Donald Sterling out of there is there was fear of a player mutiny and that they were not going to play a playoff game, at which point, nobody liked that guy anyway. And so they went ahead and they tossed him out of the paint. With the commissioner of the NFL, I believe the year we're looking at is 1981, 1982, when Al Davis takes the power away from Pete Rozelle by moving the Raiders from Oakland to Los Angeles. And then it just became clear that, we're the ones who are actually in charge here. You could even go to baseball with removing Fay Vincent as commissioner. I think that was in 1993. And his whole speech about it, people are saying that I am the last commissioner is what he titled his autobiography, because the idea that the commissioner ruled independently of the owners, if there was ever a truth to that, completely went out the window at that point. Roger Goodell is an employee in a way that, at least as being the commissioner of the NFL, had never been as stark as it is in that place. And so what you wind up with in that case is the owners don't have any interest in enforcing any standard upon themselves. They are perpetually concerned with what happens when it's my turn to be under the boot of this. And they're always thinking on that. Mark Cuban, who wound up having a toxic workplace situation with the Mavericks, it's no surprise that he was the one that stood up and was like, hey, so you're just saying if somebody catches you on tape, you're going to take our teams from us on principle? I don't like that, right? Like they're all looking at themselves in that. And so, yeah, they have billions of dollars. There's no way that you could enact what I think is a reasonable financial penalty as a league to actually hurt any of these owners. David Tepper so rich, he bought the Panthers cash. Man so rich, he once bought his old boss's $40-something million house. And the old boss had passed him over for a promotion. He bought it just to have the damn thing demolished. Like there's a level of rich in ownership in sports that did not exist when we were talking about this, even as recently as 20 years ago. Like these weren't all just zillionaires who happened to own these teams. And so I think that if you combine that with a gradual decimation of the press corps that covers this and thereby is less able to actually investigate and get to the bottom of some of this stuff, and what you got are really rich people who can operate with a certain level of impunity because there really aren't any consequences to what goes on. And a public that, man, really seems to like football and doesn't demand. On one hand, I think you have people, the majority of the American public really looks at football as everything that's right about this country without demanding rightness from the institution itself. Like it's all really complex there, but the players are always going to be under the boot of this to a degree, just because the money is so much different and the players' money itself is so tenuous.
If I could just jump in here and say something, you hit on it, Amani. They don't want to set a precedent. When the investigation was still going on in Washington, I would talk to people around the league and owners, and there was no stomach for throwing Dan Snyder out of the league or trying to force him to sell. That was not going to happen, because they don't want to set a precedent. Even the ones who think they don't have any skeletons in the closet have no idea what could be coming. And so they certainly don't want to create a situation where, somebody is going to look back and say, well, 5 years ago, we pushed Dan Snyder off the cliff. Why shouldn't we do it to you? So the idea now that, why can't the league force Dan Snyder to get rid of the team, or why can't the league present those emails? That's the power dynamic is switched. That's not the dynamic. The league office is not in charge here. The owners are in charge here.
That being the case, one of the most influential owners is Robert Kraft, and I'll make this a toss-up question here. Whoever wants to grab it and run with it. When you read the Jeff Pash accounts, general counsel of the National Football League, and his conversations with Bruce Allen, very clubby, familiar, back and forth, a couple of guys sharing tasteless remarks back and forth, and Pash breezily at one point doing away with a fine against the then Redskins. It was a minor fine, but don't worry, you don't have to pay it. What's Robert Kraft thinking when Jeff Pash was the guy in 2007 in Foxborough, literally grinding the Spygate tapes under his shoes to destroy them, and Pash was in the middle of all of the NFL machinations having to do with Deflategate? Equal justice under NFL law. Does it exist? Anyone?
Oh, but I think what Kraft had to see what was clear about Spygate and Bountygate and a few others, which is they get those verdicts on those cases first, and then they go back and try to figure out how to backfill it, And I'm actually glad you mentioned Jeff Pash, because I had actually just kind of forgotten about that. The way he and Bruce Allen scoffed at the diversity initiatives of the league in the emails were telling. That was a really big thing there, that the counsel for the league and Bruce Allen are just kind of laughing this off. And Bruce Allen, who has to be sitting at his house being like, guys, you can't tell who they're really coming after. The one whose name is in every story. The only person whose name is in every story is Bruce Allen's. Nobody cares. He's like, yo, it's me. It's me they're trying to get. But them scoffing at what is actually something that is, a good thing the league should be doing, and something I believe that Roger Goodell actually cares about. And they just threw that out the window.
Yeah, that was Goodell's finest hour, I think, in 2017. It was the whole Kaepernick thing was going, the various player groups. There was a high personal investment. We talked about the new money and the gulf between what these franchises are worth now and what player salaries as enhanced as they are. Charlie, what does that do? Go back 20, 30 years. You're leading the NBA players, and franchise values were here. Now they're exponentially, they've exploded. What does that explosion do to that power dynamic and the sense of who's calling the shots and what the stakes are? I think you're muted, sir. There we go.
The biggest thing is that these franchise values, when we created this concept called revenue sharing, we identified and defined the revenue that is going to be shared. The increase in value of the franchise is not part of that equation. It's growing at a faster rate. And of course, the power base continues. Remember, we were looking at the projection of $25 billion by the NFL in 2025. That goal is going to be realized one way or the other. And we all thought that the concussion, the CTE issue, was going to send football in a different direction. It has not. It has continued to grow at an increasing rate, those franchise values. So the power thing has always been there. It's only just been greater. The question is the percentage of the gross, if you want to call it that, gross, adjusted, defined gross, That's not growing at the same rate that the franchise values are growing. So that power, if you want to put it in dollars and cents, is clearly coming back to those who own the teams. The players' salaries, as I'm sure George would attest, that 50-50 split is not 50-50 of everything. Most people, as soon as you hear that 50-50 split, you think it's 50 cents on every dollar. It's probably worth more like it's probably 50% of 70% of all the revenue. And then you add to that the increased value of these franchises. So that power of NFL football, as you point out, they have their own day. At the rate they're going to have multiple days. Okay. I guess part of that is that, I've never been a believer in these long-term contracts, these long-term collective bargaining agreements, for many for that very same reason, that because they are a monopoly and because they are cartels, there's nowhere else these TV partners are going. So there's no real incentive to me to sign those long-term deals, because the broadcast partners can't get any other content. You guys know what the content is in the NFL. Where are they going to replace that?
$110 billion was just committed. $110 billion in media rights.
Yeah, and I'm saying that I believe it in total, if it wasn't a 10-year deal, it was a 6-year deal, that over 18 years, it would be much more than that. Because there's only one customer here. I'm the NFL football. If my contract expired every 3 to 5 or 6 or 7 years, in terms of gross over time, it'd be far more than we've made at this point. There's only one NFL, guys. And as we have noticed, some of these other leagues that have tried to get started, there's no way that ever happens.
Well, let me jump in, if I may, Bob, and respond to some of that. And I know this is not a discussion about CBAs, but as of 2011, players were getting 47 cents on every dollar that came in. That in 2020 jumped up to 48 and can rise. So we have an accounting for every dollar that comes in. What we're seeing in the NFL is an interesting dynamic where players are actually getting paid at the same rate that revenues are coming in, but the careers have not extended long enough for them to take, they have a lot more to lose, right? So this idea that NFL players are going to upend the table and prepare properly for a lockout or go on strike to effectuate the change that some of you have referred to is a massive, massive challenge, because the money is huge these days. Little known fact, there are about 25 players in the NFL who have $100 million contracts. So it's not that the money's not available to players or they're not taking advantage of it. It's these long-term collective bargaining agreements lock players in, lock owners into a system where everybody is able to make as much money as possible. On the power dynamic and the power structure, you are correct that when players speak up, that when players take action like we saw in 2016 and 2017, everybody takes notice. And in some cases, NFL owners and the league office, sometimes they don't know what to do, right? So my experience with that was when the quote unquote kneeling controversy happened, first they wanted to institute a rule, then they instituted a rule, we filed a grievance over that rule, and then between May and July, everybody changed their minds and said this was a bad idea, right? And the leverage that players had.
Knew it was a bad idea right out of the gate.
They did. We told them it was a bad idea. Let me just say this: we told you so, right? Yeah. I was in those meetings, so I can tell you I told them so. Between May and July, those actions were completely upended. And it was because of player power and player leverage. So, Bo, you hit on something with Sterling. Players made a decision they weren't going to play for him. And that accelerated whatever benevolent and gracious thing that Adam was going to do for the NBA. We want to see that in football. Our union wants to see that in football. We made a push for that with voluntary workouts over the summer. We just want to see the power dynamic change, and we know it falls on us, and it should.
What leverage do you have to make that happen?
We can take a ton of action. We can do, well, now I don't want to give away the farm here, Bob, but
Well, I think we can guess at some of the things.
yeah,
But
we certainly have leverage when it comes to using the players' platform. We certainly have leverage when it comes to what you saw last year when players came together and put out a video, the top stars calling for the league to take these issues seriously. We have leverage when it comes to withholding our services, right? We have an entire offseason that's built on voluntary participation. You don't have to do what you don't want to do. And in the COVID year, we proved that you didn't need an offseason for players to get the reps and the amount that they needed to play a successful year and to perform on the field. So there are levers that players can pull. The challenge our union has is that, like with any union, you need 100% participation 100% of the time. That's the labor management paradigm. 100% participation 100% of the time.
Let me also go back to that franchise value. The players do not share in the increased value of the franchise.
Yeah, I didn't suggest that they did, but I mean, if they want to sell the team, they can sell the team, right?
No, but I'm saying there's no allocation in the sharing of revenue. For example, since I can't get a share of your increased value each year, then I should get 55% of the revenue we do share. There's no allocation for the increased value of a franchise. And that's what separates that power base.
Right. Well, we can say that players deserve 60%.
Well, the point is that there is no allocation, is what I'm saying to you, that the franchise value is not shared by the players. That increased value to 4 billion, 3 billion, whatever that number is, whatever that increase is, whether it's 10, 18, 14% value each year, is not shared by the players. There's no allocation in the formula that they receive anything for the increased value of franchises. Now, that's in basketball too. That's always been that area out there that players are looking for some share of that growth and that wealth. But since they don't share that, that also increases that power base.
Don't disagree, but like any negotiation, it's what are you willing to do for it?
Oh, I agree. But again, until players are ready to strike and miss a full season or two, then this power base will not change.
Yeah, but that's the dilemma, right? That the NFL players are primarily dudes who are not rich. Like, it sounds crazy to come out and say making $500,000 a year isn't a lot of money, but making $500,000 a year for most people is after you've been making money along the way, and then you get there and you bought stuff and you've had things or whatever it is. But that is a membership that largely just doesn't have that kind of money, right? And they're in their 20s and they do stupid stuff with money, right? There's really nothing, hey, you guys might want to buckle up. There might be a strike. Yeah, okay, I got you, dog. And then, and then it never happens. And so what the owners are able to do now, especially now that the owner class is much richer than it used to be, they can play the long game forever if they want to. But one thing I feel like we learned in the 2011 lockout, though, with the NFL that is interesting, they can play the long game as long as they want to, but they got a little antsy by the end of that, too. They're like, hey, we'd like to get back here because they're greedy at the end of the day. So, hey, we'd like to get back here and make a little of this money. And then they get there. But it's just hard when you kind of got some money and they got all the money. And that is a difficult stare down, I think, to ask of anyone. And the advantage, again, that they have, it's guys who are old and been rich for a long time dealing with the nouveau riche.
It's also, I think, something that we saw during the last negotiation, and George knows this better than anybody, but you saw the difference. I mean, right, there's roughly 2,000 people, guys in the union, and you saw the differences within them, right? You had the superstar players who have had very long careers and who have the $100 million contracts. They might be more willing to go out or stay out than, the guy who's going to be on the practice squad, or the guy who's in the first or second year of his career and it does not have the $100 million. And you saw that struggle in there, and the differences in what those people wanted in the CBA. It's hard, as George said, you got to have 100% of the time. And we saw it there sort of pulling apart as they were trying to get that CBA done. All of it done against the background of a pandemic was about to come, and everybody knew that the financial situation was going to be even more unstable than it already is. So that's a tough ask, especially in the NFL where there's so many guys.
George, bringing it back to our reason for being here, what are you hearing from membership, and where is this? You talked about the human cost, especially of things that Dee's encountered in his career, but I'm sure everyone internalizing what they see and hear in these emails. Where is that on things I've got to deal with the league about? I mean, it's
players from our office or all of it.
I'm sorry.
I said, you mean from players or from our office or from?
No, from the membership. From the membership.
Yeah. I think there is an interesting level of, I'm not surprised. Like almost this has been received with a shrug of, hey man, I just play football. I'm not surprised, right? With the exception of individual players who have taken this hard, and obviously, somebody like Carl, who took a day to sort of process all that was going on. That's not to say that it doesn't hurt them personally under the surface, but I feel like the membership has met all of this with why is anybody surprised, right? Like again, it's a little bit of a, we told you so. And there's also a little bit of, DeMorris especially, and the player directors, the group of folks who deal with the membership, who have been preaching about this for years. I mean, we've communicated to the membership all the power dynamics. We've communicated to them that there is no oversight other than themselves. So there's a little bit of that. I think spinning it forward, again, we want to see transparency because, as Judy said, 10 years ago was not like 1963 here. Like we have been dealing with this business that has exploded from a $9 billion business to a nearly $17 billion business. COVID be darned, full steam ahead. And it's just everybody's a little too comfortable with some of the behavior that was expressed in those emails.
Yeah, getting back to that, that point, expounding on that, George, and something that Bomani brought up earlier is, we've seen this movie before, lots of times. We mentioned, Mark Cuban, Donald Sterling, and I'll turn to you, Bomani. What is it going to take for any real impactful change to happen? We have outrage now. That's good, but the news cycle eventually is going to move on. And what's to say in 6 months, a year, we're not going to have a very similar story?
Silly me, but I do believe that we in media have some measure of power on these things and the ability to kind of sway public opinion and a measure of pressure that you wind up getting up top. So like, for example, I know me, myself personally, when it comes to college stuff, I watch colleges take down stuff off of Twitter because I said something, right? Like I've seen things actually change, off of an outside the lines parting shot about Oklahoma State, and then suddenly there's a Mike Gundy apology or something that comes out. Like this does happen. The larger NFL press corps, for whatever reason, is not really a questioning bunch. Like this goes differently from sport to sport. It's not a broad indictment of anybody. It's just kind of what the levels of engagement are there. Baseball writers are typically very, very critical. They're a bit more like go after the institution. That's just always been the way that they're sort of built. Like hockey, they just love killing their commissioner. That's their favorite thing to do. The NBA writers are very defensive of the institution itself and all the people who don't like it. I mean, like, you know, we can go on and on with that. But there is no real ground level pressure on these owners, whether on a national level or on a local level. And so again, when this thing happened on Friday, we kind of played it macro level with kid gloves. When the thing happened with Gruden, for whatever's worth, the second thing, the Monday night thing, he got out fast. Like that report came out and he was out of that job within 2 hours. We didn't even have a chance to go do anything. But there is, I think, a level of scrutiny that we can give collectively to NFL owners that we don't. And I just think that part of it is, as a society, we have such a reverence for rich people and just a general belief that if you have made these billions of dollars, there's a respect that you deserve. Never mind the significant portion of these guys that inherited these billions of dollars that they had. They ain't even have to go do nothing for it. And we still feel like, hey, well, your daddy got it, so I guess that means something about you, right? We still lean with it. I do think there's something that can be said just from pushing harder back against those people. But there's, you know, these relationships are tenuous, and as newspapers are having a harder time, can you afford to do something that's going to perhaps restrict your access, which then all of a sudden gets you into a place where they fear the lost subscriptions? If you are a rights holder, are you going to go out and actively engage and get into a battle with these people that you do business with? That's where it gets hard, but I still think that we have the power in our job to make some things happen, or I'd like to think that.
Judy, I'd love your take on that, especially with the NFL media, given that you're in it.
I do think the media has a role. And I think in the past, the media has played some role. The Kaepernick thing probably most prominently. I mean, we would not have known as much about Kaepernick's protest if it were not for the media and the continuous coverage of it. And I do think eventually that applied pressure. George brought up the thing when they were going to have a rule. I was covering that meeting, that owners meeting, when they were going to put the rule in saying like, well, if you want to protest, just stay in the locker room instead. And I mean, in real time, we were saying, how is this going to work, right? Like, what? Who's going to go along with this idea? So I do think the media, I agree with Bomani, has a role to play. The Washington Post, for example, has played a huge role in the Washington football team issues coming to light. If it were not for the Washington Post, we wouldn't know any of this. So we do have a role. There are certainly issues I agree with about, especially on the beat writer level. That is a tough spot to be in because it does affect your access and it does affect your ability to cover the team on a day-to-day basis. And that is a constant struggle. But I don't have any question that if you just keep asking questions, you at least force them into a position of having to answer them. There's a league meeting coming up in however many, 10 days, I think it is, a week, 10 days. And that'll be our first opportunity in front of them to ask questions, including of the commissioner. I assume we're going to get a chance to talk to the commissioner there.
Oh, the leaks from that meeting. That'll be classic. BJ, are we in a position, I think, now to expand to include our audience as well, right?
Yes, I'd like to ask, if you have questions of our panel, please hit the raise your hand button. We'll start to call on you. We would ask when you're called on to turn on your camera and mic, identify who you are, where you're from, and please direct a question to one panelist, not all of them. We want to get to as many as possible. So now we'll open the floor for questions. Just raise your hand and we'll get to as many as we possibly can in our remaining time here. Let's start with Patrick Fisher.
Hi, I'm Patrick Fisher. I'm a junior at Seton Hall. And my question is directed towards Bomani Jones. And I was wondering, so this Gruden email happened when he was at ESPN. So what does this make you think? Was there more instances of this throughout the ESPN family where there's these emails from other employees, do you think? Because this didn't happen while he was like a NFL coach at the time.
Yeah, it didn't happen while he was an NFL coach, but let's be clear. John Gruden has been an NFL coach every day of his life since 1999. Like, that's what he is. He had a job with ESPN because he was an NFL coach. Like, so this is not to try to absolve or shake the company away from anything like this. I just don't think that there's really a connection that I could responsibly make between the two. Like, it's not like John Gruden was coming up to the office from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, hanging out and immersed in the culture. John Gruden got a better agent than that. John Gruden is sitting at his house watching film, and then every now and then you call him in. He goes to the draft. Hey, John, we need you to come to upfronts. Will you show up? He goes and does that. But I don't think anybody could reasonably make an argument that like John Gruden was truly like part of the fabric of ESPN in a way that would then make me say, do I need to look at anybody else? Honestly, I feel like if you look at those John Gruden emails, that would make you at me or you or anybody, if it's going to make you ask questions about what's happening at a job or a place, you need to look at the one that you in, right? Like, one thing that does happen, I'll never forget this, and this is not perfectly analogous, but when I was in graduate school at North Carolina, somebody accidentally sent out an email about someone in my cohort, basically, I don't think this guy is going to be good enough to get a PhD. And he just ran through and he accidentally sent it to every graduate student. Okay. And what I realized in that moment is, oh, that's how they talk about us. But I also knew it wasn't how they talk about us here at the University of North Carolina. This how they talk about graduate students everywhere. So I don't think it's fair. You can make the argument that it's unfair of me by me broadening out this far, but I think that is more responsible than localizing it in this case.
Yeah. On the practical level, Patrick, those emails are just symptoms of, before it's a symptom of anything, which is winning bigotry bingo, if you will. It's just stupidity and not understanding that emails live forever. The one thing I would always tell my staff was, and this had nothing to do with off-color remarks or I don't think or offensive remarks, but having to do with the practice of journalism. Never send an email you don't want to have to read from the witness stand. And if that's your guiding star, and it's a hell of a way to look at it, but it's one way to conduct business. You know, we had an occasion, some litigation we were involved in I won't get specific, but in discovery, I'm reading in interrogatories, and a whole bunch of my emails are in it about, how we formulated the story. And I'd forgotten the story 7-8 years ago. I was kind of happy we had done it by the book, and everybody I dealt with was doing it by the book. And there it was in the lawsuit proving it. We did it by the book. Digital memory is forever.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Let's go to Kayvan Desai. You're up next, Kayvan.
Hi, my name's Kayvan Desai. I'm also a senior here at Seton Hall, and my question was for Mr. Atala. And so I was curious if you, as a high-ranking member of the NFL Players Association, if you've prepared for the possibility that there's a group of players or even some individuals who come out and say words like John Gruden's have caused cultural issues around the league and have possibly driven me out of the league because, whether it be mental health reasons, anything like that. Do you think as a Players Association rep, there should be a plan for you to possibly prepare to help these players? Or do you think the owners are on too high of a throne to kind of keep letting this go further?
That's a great question, and thank you for that. And please call me George. A lot of the union's work is under the radar, and we have resources upon resources upon resources. We have mental health counselors available to players. We have, all sorts of tools that they can access in order to get help if they need it for all sorts of issues. And that's something that we have been really proud of, especially in the last 12 years, for not just current players, but for former players as well. And we do our best to reach out to those active and former players to make sure they know that those resources are available to them. But as I alluded to earlier, the majority of our active membership that I've spoken with have met all of this with a shrug and this is what we've always known. These things don't surprise us, and time to get ready for the game next weekend. Because the other thing that is phenomenal about NFL players that makes them so incredibly successful is that when they're in season mode, there is a tick-tock of a rhythm to the season that just, they are not going to be taken off of that track, right? Sunday's game day, Monday's film day, Tuesday's off day, Wednesday's practice, Thursday's back in practice, Friday's team day, Saturday we're traveling, Sunday we're getting ready to play. And that is a cadence that is, in order to be successful in this league and to frankly keep your job, that is a challenge that we have with NFL players during the season, is that there is no getting off of that track for the most part.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go to Jackson Shank. You're up next, Jackson.
Hey, I'm a freshman at Seton Hall, and yeah. Anyway, Bomani, I wanted to know what your take was as a journalist on the removal of John Gruden from the Ring of Honor. We never got to talk about that, and I want to know, was it just like a representation type thing of the Buccaneers organization, or was it just kind of the cherry on top that John Gruden kind of gave to himself?
So I think there are a couple levels of this. One, I think that what happens, so for example, when people who work on television do something egregious and they get taken, the question is, do we keep you in this job? To me, the question really comes down to, you strip away whatever morality that you have in it is, can I look at that person and think about what they're actually doing right now? Because if I look at that person and all I can think about is whatever this galling moment was, then they got to be off TV. That's just how it goes. That's just kind of what the viewing experience is. It's going to be a long time before you can look at John Gruden's name in that Ring of Honor, right? Somewhere near Tony Dungy's and all this stuff, and not be able to think about that one thing, right? And to be honest, he didn't win a playoff game there after that Super Bowl. I mean, his place in that Ring of Honor is actually somewhat tenuous if you want to get down to the bottom of it. But this was my problem with it. How much do we know about the people who own that team and where their money goes and what the causes are that they support? You could make the argument that they are as morally egregious as what John Gruden did and said in those emails. What John Gruden did, though, was violate the real rule, which is don't be gauche, don't be impolite. And he put this thing in terms that just hit people in such a way. But functionally speaking, I could argue that the Glazer family have maybe given some money to some politicians who would say the same exact things that John Gruden was, right? So I think it's a fairly audacious thing for those people to make the decision that they were going to do that. But, I mean, obviously they did not do the same thing, but this is kind of the same question of, do you leave O.J. Simpson's Heisman Trophy jersey up at USC, or do you do it at Buffalo? The reason, or any of those things, you take it down not simply because of what he did, but because every time you see it, you think about O.J. Simpson killing somebody, right? People your age have a completely different concept of O.J. Simpson before, when he was the most heroic person there. But once it stopped being that, you stop treating him like a hero. And that's where I think John Gruden is.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, let's go to Matthew Page.
Okay, hi. I'm a freshman here at Seton Hall. So I'm going to direct this to Mr. Grantham. So throughout all of John Gruden's career, he was literally traded. Never heard of a coach being traded for. And then he went to ESPN. He was probably the highest paid employee there. And then he was signed for 10 years, $100 million as a coach. Do you think John Gruden, the power that he got, and he's basically given the keys to the whole organization, that it became too, he felt like he was untouchable?
Well, I think a 10-year deal for $10 million a year kind of puts you in that category. He was sort of given the keys to the car. So I guess your answer is yes. He got too much power, and he abused it.
And Judy, isn't there any indication that there's going to be a settlement on the balance of this deal? The tens of millions still due him?
It sounds that way. There's sort of some speculation of, can he go after that money, even though, he was allowed to resign, but obviously he would have been fired for cause here. So there's going to be a lot of lawyers involved and more negotiations. And there's no question he's going to want to claw back as much of that, whatever's left on the contract.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Mark Davis did not want to fire him either, which has to make it easier for John to get that money.
Sort of if we back up the timeline a little bit, a week ago, before the second story ran in the New York Times, before he resigned, the league was getting kind of antsy that nothing had happened at that point. I think when they gave the emails to the Raiders, now about 10 days ago, however many days, 2 weeks ago, they thought there would be action kind of quickly. The fact that he coached last Sunday, I think took a few people back. And the fact that then it got to, early Monday afternoon, a week ago, and nothing had happened tells you everything you need to know, that Mark Davis did not want to have to do this. He had to be nudged. And then, the second story in the New York Times was the final shove. But, yes, I think he was very reluctant. And even just his remark, go ask the NFL, they have all the answers, suggests he was at least as unhappy with the league office as he was with John Gruden.
Then you've got what Amy Trask, as I mentioned earlier in our event this evening, said that she had heard Bruce Allen, by implication, make offensive comments and reported it to the owner, imputing that it's Mark Davis, and going back several years. So if Mark Davis had this brought to him and did nothing, or did he send it to the legal? I mean, that's a whole other branch of the story. It's a story that keeps on giving. It's a journalist's dream. Nightmare, actually. But yeah.
Bob, I need to say one sentence about this, because I've been trying to suppress some of the anger, and all of a sudden the feelings have just come back. The reason it was okay for no action to be taken between the Friday email and the Sunday game was because DeMaurice Smith was a black labor lawyer who wasn't one of them. Period. That just needed to be said as bluntly as possible.
Right. We haven't even broached the topic, as it's a parlor game of who leaked it, but and how much leverage the commissioner and the central office may have by not releasing those emails, and who knows what else is in there and what they'll use it for. That's a whole nother hour.
Yeah, for sure.
I got my guess.
There you go. We're a booking agency as well as higher learning, institution of higher learning. All right, we have time for two more. We'll go to Quinn Riley. Quinn, you're up next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. This is actually Quinn Riley's dad. He never came home from his pickup game at the YMCA for basketball, so I apologize. But I couldn't help but stay on the queue. And I think you're right, Mr. Lee. I mean, this is a reporter's dream, because, I mean, have they even started on peeling the fact that how disturbing is it that Mark Davis is mad that Gruden got railroaded or blindsided? And these comments were made a decade ago. Well, that's not very long ago, quite frankly, when these terms that were being used, unfortunately, 40 years ago, they may have been part of the vernacular of how people talked about sex, different, whether it's homosexual, whatever it is. But 10 years ago, there was no place for that, and there isn't anymore, obviously. I mean, is that going to be talked about at some point? That how was Mark Davis dumb enough to kind of say this? He got railroaded.
Well, you may have stumped the band, as on the old Carson show, because, I mean, getting back to Bomani's point, just because you inherit a team doesn't mean you inherit all that goes with it.
I have a theory.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay, so, and this again, Quinn's dad, you could remember this. Quinn would not remember this, but for the youngsters, the Raiders used to be a really, really, really big deal, like a legitimate national brand. Part of what's fascinating about them right now was I didn't think they should move to Las Vegas, because I thought they'd be playing 16 road games, because everybody else's fans would be coming in for their weekend in Las Vegas, and they hadn't gotten there. Except Raiders, the ones in Oakland, it's like it doesn't matter if the Raiders have a city, right? Wherever they're going, we're going. The Raiders, when they moved to LA, the Raiders fans that were in LA stayed Raiders fans, and they fly to Vegas. Like, they are a really big deal, and that all centers around one man, and that man's name was Al Davis, right? That's why they still got the Al Davis stickers on the helmet. Other than George Halas, I don't think any one man has been more aligned with a franchise, and even with Davis, where Davis designed the uniforms and would go through to the company store at the mall and make sure everything was set up. Like,
he coached the team at one point.
Yes, he coached the team until 1972, when he kind of stole the team, and nobody really talks about that anymore. He was the face, and then when Al Davis dies, this is a franchise with no identity. And I think that Mark Davis made the decision that they needed an identity again, another man that was at the front of this that would represent the whole team. And he went and got John Gruden. That's the only way 10 years, $100 million makes sense for somebody that nobody was going to offer that much money to him with the plan to move there. And so I think for him, there was a brand identity to the Raiders that he hoped would be built around John Gruden. And he was going to hold on to that no matter what. Now, on the other hand, I'm giving Mark Davis a lot of credit for something that I think would be a really smart thing to do. And I cannot necessarily assume that any second generation NFL owner is doing any goddamn thing that's smart. Not a single one of them. If you want to look around this league at the ones that are the worst run, they are all pretty much second generation and Dan Snyder. Like, just about all of them are the inheritors of the teams.
So was I kind of off base then? Did Davis? I thought I heard that he kind of was miffed about, and I'll get off right now, but I thought he was miffed about the fact that wouldn't you have kind of said, you saw those emails, let's just walk away and
no. But as George said, he could have written that first one out. It was just the next ones that proved to be too much. But if they had just made it through, they could have made it through a couple of days. Like, you'd be amazed what you can get by with if you can just ride it out for a couple of days. I mean, Tirico and Tony Dungy had his back. Drew Brees ran away. Like, nobody was trying to say anything. Charles Woodson and Tim Brown had already come to be hey, I know that guy. He would never say such a thing. They had everything in line. And then they were like, nah, how you going to explain all of this? And then it was just like, oh, okay. I mean, think about, again, he quit in 2 hours after keeping the job for 3 days.
Well, that article last Monday in the New York Times, it read like something from The Onion. It could not be this bad. As I said, bigotry bingo. And I'm not saying that to be funny. I mean, who didn't he offend? So, and the ultimate irony is that Al Davis, and I spent some time with him, in his latter years. He was a man known for integration, for civil rights, for progressive in the world of football, which is saying something in the world of football.
He was too much of a sociopath to let a little thing like race or gender get in the way.
Just win, baby.
Grand irony.
Just win, baby.
Just win.
Thank you so much for this. We were just happened to be online tonight. Quinn's applying for Seton Hall, and Kathy's, my wife, saw this, and we got on. This is a great, and Bob Ley, we were at the thing that you and Bob Costas did a couple years ago at campus, and it was great. We enjoyed it. Thanks so much for this. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being here. Good luck to your son.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll end on our final question from Ricky. Ricky, you got the final word of the day, or at least the question of the day.
Thank you very much, guys. My name is Ricky. I'm a sports journalism professor at the University of Arkansas. I'm wondering, is there an alternative that what we can do to people who expose themselves as racist, homophobic, or misogynistic? We tend to just tell people, I'm sorry, your career is over. We're throwing you out with the trash. You can never, ever come back. You are a horrible person. What about education? Because the next person who does this could be in his 20s and his 30s. Why not force these people to perhaps go through DEI training for 6 months with experts in the field, and they can really try to explain to these people why their views are so archaic, and they can determine if they've learned anything. It just seems like a very extreme punishment that we try to ruin the careers of these people. I'm wondering if there are any alternatives to what we do to people right now.
Are you asking this question about a dude that got hundreds of millions of dollars?
Well,
We're like with John Gruden, we're not ruining that man in the course of this. That man is going to sleep on a pile of money right now. Now, here's where I agree with you. all of these things require a path to redemption, right? Like if you don't have a path to redemption, then people have no reason to change or anything. There's nothing to look forward to, right? I make this example all the time about Ray Rice, who has done every single thing that you ever asked for somebody to do, if possible, to atone for such a thing, and never got another job, anything else. But Ray Rice is still out here doing this. But nobody had to explain to Ray Rice that you were wrong for punching your wife or your girlfriend at the time in the elevator. Nobody need to explain to John Gruden that you don't say things like that, because he wouldn't say those things in front of people. And in fact, the most telling thing about him was all those harsh views he had about Kaepernick by email. He had none of them on broadcast when it was time to talk about him. This is not a matter of someone not recognizing their mistakes. That's a benefit of the doubt that I don't think that somebody like Gruden deserves. But at the same time, he's not being ruined. If John Gruden came like what you described, if he went and did that on his own, and he came back and he said, look, I've been talking to people, I've been working to this, I'm telling you, this world would welcome him back with wide open arms. We have seen this happen over and over and over again, but what it requires is an accountability that John Gruden clearly didn't want to demonstrate on his way out the door. Sorry, I hurt your feelings. And then he rolled. So I think, to what you say, if John Gruden demonstrated that he really cared about this and wanted to come back from it, he would not have a problem. And I think that even the people, the aggrieved parties in this case, would be welcoming of him to come in. But the idea, for me personally, is a bit offensive that we're just ruining these people's careers and it feels like it's extreme. If you are in a position as Gruden was, where you're requiring people to trust you. So like, let's say he even wanted to do television. Those views that he has about black people, coupled with the fact that as a coach, he never had a black quarterback ever. And coupled with the fact that he's the dude that, after Nathan, the Peterman, threw all the interceptions for Buffalo, has still kept him on a roster. When I hear John Gruden on TV talking about a black quarterback, I don't know if he's actually talking about the quarterback anymore. That's not ruining his career. He has made it impossible for him to do that job. That's on him. That ain't on nobody else but him.
Ricky, thank you for your question, sir. Appreciate it. And that takes us to our conclusion. And our thanks to all who logged on tonight, and especially our thanks, Judy, Charlie, George, Bomani. We cannot thank you enough for your time and airing out. And we started small, went big, and went even bigger. And it was, I think, to the benefit of all that we had this conversation. The latest in our series of sports media speakers in our series at Seton Hall. So on behalf of BJ Schecter, good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you all.
That was a great time.
It was.